The Flaxborough regatta was meant to be the highlight of the summer season, a day of bunting, brass bands, and half-hearted races across the sluggish river that wound through the town. Housewives prepared sandwiches, children waved paper flags, and the more ambitious council members practiced speeches about civic pride. Even the weather had conspired to offer a pale but obliging sun. All promised an event of harmless predictability, until Admiral Fudge climbed onto the podium to award the silver oar. He was, as always, dressed for command, jacket heavy with brass buttons, cap perched at a heroic angle, mustache waxed to perfection. But when the crowd hushed and he stepped forward, something was immediately and shockingly amiss. His trousers were gone. Not missing in some minor, ill-tailored way, but absent altogether. Below the splendid jacket and polished shoes, the Admiral's bare legs, pale as haddock fillets, shone in the sunlight. For a moment, the square held its breath. Then laughter erupted, high-pitched and uncontrollable, mingling with gasps of disbelief. Children pointed, old ladies covered their faces, the band blared a discordant note as the trombonist collapsed into wheezing hysteria. The Admiral froze, his face a shade of scarlet seldom seen outside the butcher's counter, before staggering backwards and disappearing into the marquee, pursued by the roar of scandal. The incident was destined to become Flaxborough's most memorable regatta before the oars had even touched the water. Within minutes, tongues wagged as energetically as the sails in the breeze. "I tell you," whispered Mrs. Pilbeam, eyes glittering, "it was deliberate. Someone planned it. You don't just lose your trousers." "Planned? Nonsense," scoffed Councillor Dabb. "The man's absent-minded. He probably forgot to put them on." "Forgot?" hissed the verger, his tone grim. "You don't forget decency. That was sabotage. Mark my words, an attack on the town's dignity." A boatman from the pub, still choking with laughter, added his theory. "I bet it was young Hopcroft, sneaking in for a prank. He's always up to tricks. And Fudge has enemies, oh yes. Too many fines for fishing without a license." "Enemies? Pah," muttered another. "It was his wife, I'd wager. Serves him right, strutting about like Nelson. She's had enough, I dare say." So the voices clashed and tangled, suspicion settling wherever prejudice found a foothold. The Admiral himself had vanished behind the marquee flaps, refusing to emerge, leaving behind a vacuum that the town immediately filled with its invention. Purbright arrived not long after, stepping into the chaos with his habitual mildness, as though public disrobings were a feature of every regatta. Sergeant Love, crimson with embarrassment on the Admiral's behalf, cleared a path. Purbright's eyes roved calmly over the crowd, catching not only the laughter, but the quick, guilty glances between those who suspected too much or too little. Inside the marquee, the Admiral sat collapsed on a chair, a borrowed rug wrapped about his waist. His mustache drooped, his dignity all but sunk. "Inspector," he groaned, "this is intolerable. I am the victim of a conspiracy." Purbright inclined his head. "I have no doubt, Admiral. Trousers rarely vanish without assistance." He moved about the space, eyes lingering on details others had missed. There, beside the podium, lay the Admiral's discarded cap, oddly scuffed with damp earth. On the floor, a safety pin gleamed, twisted as though wrenched open. And on the chair where the Admiral had sat earlier in the morning, a scrap of dark cloth clung, too small to be torn from ordinary trousers, but suggesting something had snagged or been cut. Purbright bent, lifting the pin between finger and thumb. "Curious, Sergeant," he said, his voice low but carrying. "Humiliation is rarely spontaneous. It prefers preparation." Love, notebook ready, muttered, "So you think someone undressed him on purpose?" Purbright allowed the faintest smile. "Not undressed, Sergeant. Arranged." The Admiral was dressed as he expected. It was only the expectation that was altered. The remark, mild though it was, hung in the air like a quotation destined for repetition. Already, Townsfolk clustered at the marquee entrance, whispering about pins and scraps, repeating the inspector's words as though they carried gospel weight. Just as calm began to settle, another commotion flared. A young boy burst into the tent, brandishing a pair of trousers aloft like a captured flag. "Found 'em," he crowed. "In the river, caught on the ferry rope." The crowd outside shrieked with fresh laughter, but Purbright's gaze sharpened. Wet, yes, but too neatly folded at the waist, as though placed rather than lost. And in the pocket, revealed when he took them gently from the boy, a slip of paper, dry despite the soaking cloth. He opened it. On the page was scrawled a name. Raxter. Love gasped. "The councillor. Do you suppose—" Purbright folded the trousers carefully over his arm. "Suppositions, Sergeant, are plentiful in Flaxborough. What interests me is why a man's dignity should vanish into the river, accompanied by another man's name." The Admiral groaned again, but his humiliation had already been overtaken by intrigue. The town, sensing a second act in the drama, forgot its laughter and leaned into scandal with greedy anticipation. For if trousers could disappear and reappear carrying accusation, then something far more deliberate was afoot than mere embarrassment. The Admiral's trousers, once the subject of mirth, now hung damply in the evidence room of the police station, laid flat across a table like some absurd exhibit at a museum. The slip of paper bearing Councillor Raxter's name had been carefully placed in an envelope, its presence more perplexing than damning. Purbright regarded, both with the patient interest of a man accustomed to the ridiculous disguises truth often wore in Flaxborough. Love, meanwhile, hovered, his pencil poised to sketch conclusions. "Raxter's name in the pocket can't be a coincidence," Love said, eager. "He's ambitious, likes to embarrass rivals. Maybe he thought exposing the Admiral would make him look a fool, and himself the hero." Purbright touched the cloth gently, noting the neatness with which the trousers had been folded before their watery exile. "If humiliation was the goal, Sergeant, it has already succeeded. But humiliation delivered too neatly is rarely its own reward. One must ask, why fold what was meant to be found?" Love frowned, then brightened. "To plant the note, so that when they were discovered, the blame would fall directly on Raxter." "Perhaps," Purbright murmured. "Yet planting evidence is like planting bulbs. One must be certain of the season. Who was expected to discover them and when? A boy with a sharp eye and a fondness for mischief, or someone else altogether?" Before Love could respond, a knock interrupted. Constable Hallam entered with the awkward pride of a man bearing fresh gossip. "Message from the Regatta Committee, sir. Councillor Raxter insists on speaking to you. Says he's being slandered." Purbright nodded as though the summons had been inevitable. They found Raxter in his office above the solicitors, red-faced and indignant, waving a newspaper in one hand. "Look at this. Admiral's humiliation, Raxter's hand suspected. My name was dragged through the mud on account of a pair of trousers. Preposterous. I demand protection of my reputation." Purbright accepted the paper, scanning the headlines with mild interest. "It seems, Councillor, that your reputation has been given more attention than usual. Not all would consider that a misfortune." Raxter spluttered. "Attention? It's ridiculous. I've worked years on the council, and now schoolboys shout my name in the street as though it were a punchline." Love asked bluntly, "Where were you during the regatta, sir?" Raxter fixed him with a glare. "At the mayor's side, naturally. Half the town saw me. You'll not find me skulking about the Admiral's wardrobe." Purbright's eyes lingered on the councillor's immaculate cuffs. "And yet your name appears folded neatly in the Admiral's pocket. A curious journey for a councillor to make." Raxter blustered, swore innocence, and accused his rivals, chiefly Councillor Dabb, of planting the evidence. He ended by threatening legal action against anyone who dared suggest otherwise. Outside, Love muttered, "He's guilty as sin, sir. Look at the temper on him." "Temper, Sergeant," Purbright said gently, is often the refuge of the innocent, who have no facts to defend themselves. Guilt, on the other hand, prefers calm. Their next call took them to the Admiral's residence, a neat house guarded by rhododendrons that seemed as stiff as its master. The Admiral himself, restored to trousers of a more reliable fit, received them with wounded dignity. His mustache twitched when the subject was broached. "I tell you, Inspector, this was a calculated attack upon my honor, and upon the honor of Flaxborough. An admiral without trousers is not merely a man in his drawers, it is a symbol undermined. I demand the culprit be brought to book." "Of course, Admiral," Purbright said soothingly. "Do you recall anything unusual before your appearance on the podium?" The Admiral paused, then admitted grudgingly, "My wardrobe was disturbed." The drawer where I keep my ceremonial items was slightly ajar. I thought little of it. One does not expect sabotage in one's own home. And who had access? My wife, naturally, though she would never, and the maid. Beyond that, only a tailor who delivered a repair last week. His eyes narrowed. "But I tell you, Inspector, this has the whiff of politics about it. That Raxter fellow envies my standing." When they left, Love shook his head. "Everyone points at Raxter. Too obvious, isn't it?" "Far too obvious," Purbright replied, "which is why we must look where no one yet bothers to point." By evening, the town had already written its own chapters. In the snug of the Black Swan, patrons declared it was Raxter's revenge for an insult at the council. In the church vestry, the verger insisted it was a moral lesson from Providence, punishing the Admiral's pride. In the grocer's queue, Mrs. Pilbeam whispered that the Admiral's own wife had tired of his strutting and decided to cut him down to size. Each theory was repeated with the conviction of truth, though none matched the evidence with any care. Back at the station, Purbright reviewed the trousers once more. His eyes rested on the waistband, where the stitching seemed recently disturbed, and on the paper, whose edges bore faint traces of starch, as though torn from a laundry slip rather than written fresh. He said nothing yet, but Love caught the flicker of thought. "Sir?" Purbright folded the cloth with quiet precision. "Theatricality, Sergeant, is never without audience. What troubles me is not who laughed at the Admiral's disgrace, but who stopped laughing first." Love frowned, puzzled, but wrote it down anyway. The night settled over Flaxborough with the town abuzz, its appetite whetted by humiliation, transformed into mystery. And somewhere among its tidy houses, the hand that had folded a pair of trousers planted a note and orchestrated a spectacle waited calmly for the next ripple of scandal to spread. By morning, the river looked innocent again, its surface a sheet of pewter that reflected nothing of the previous day's hilarity. A thin mist drifted above the ferry rope where the trousers had been found, as the town insisted on saying with the reverence usually reserved, for relics. Purbright stood on the quay with his hands behind his back, regarding the rope, the piling, the slow lick of water around the ferry steps. Sergeant Love, who had not slept well for picturing bare legs and outraged mustaches, flanked him with a notebook in the earnest hope that the river might confess if stared at long enough. "It would take a firm throw to lodge cloth on that," Love said, eyeing the rope's sagging catenary. "Could have been done from the landing." "Or placed with a boat hook," Purbright replied mildly. He indicated a scuff of pale scrape on the timber bollard, fresh against the weathered grain. "A neat reach, perhaps at dawn, when even outrage sleeps in." They spoke to the ferryman, Mr. Pett, who had the incurious patience of one for whom the river was a livelihood rather than a view. He had seen nobody at the rope before the boy came running, but his wife, who prided herself on notice, remembered a figure crossing the footbridge at first light. Slight, quick, a scarf streaming behind. "Like a school lad late for prayers," she said with satisfaction at being useful. She had not seen the face. "Hopcroft," Love murmured as they walked back along the quay. "He's lanky as a bean, always dashing. Everyone says he's a mischief." "Everyone says whatever suits the story they prefer," Purbright said. "Let us ask the river's other accomplices, the laundry and the needle." The Flaxborough steam laundry was a rectangle of warmth and steam where gossip was pressed as flat as shirts. Mrs. Bayliss, who ran it with an iron certainty that starch could improve character as well as collars, received the inspector with cheerful gravity. Purbright laid the envelope on the counter and slid out the little slip. "You'll forgive the question," he said, "but does this paper look to you like a laundry docket?" Mrs. Bayliss adjusted her spectacles. "Not ours. Ours are numbered and pink, that there's a clipping off a delivery wrapper, starch round the edges where it's been smoothed. See? And the pencil, laundry blue." She sniffed. "From Raxter's, I shouldn't wonder." "Councillor Raxter?" Love blurted. "Gracious, no," said Mrs. Bayliss, amused. "Raxter and Milson, naval outfitters in Market Dern. Half the uniforms in town have passed through their hands. They pack with heavy blue wrappers, and their lads scrawl redirects on the outside. That piece looks like the corner of one." Purbright's eyes rested on the slip another moment, as one might examine a moth pinned in a case. "So the note that names a councillor may merely be the tale of a tradesman." "Likely," said Mrs. Bayliss, "and whoever tore it off had a tidy eye. Corners crisp, wouldn't swear to who wrote it, mind. Laundry blue makes all hands look cousins." Outside, Love exhaled in a small fog of steam. So it wasn't the councillor's name as such, only the outfitter's. Anyone, hearing Raxter, would leap to the wrong conclusion. "That," Purbright said, "is leaping made easy." He tilted his head. "We must call on a tailor." Mr. Blaine at the High Street tailor's had the air of a man who believed that truth could be cut to pattern if only clients would hold still. He listened to the account with offended sympathy on behalf of trousers everywhere, then examined the damp pair laid carefully on his counter. He peered, pinched, and produced a magnifying lens from his waistcoat with the flourish of a conjurer. "Not naval sergeant," he pronounced. "Civilian worsted, and see this, hemming done by machine, not hand, no braid. Admiral's dress trousers would carry a side stripe, woven, not stitched afterwards. Yours have none. The waistband stitching here is recent, though, and coarse. Someone altered these in a hurry. Basting taken out this morning, I'd say. Cloths stretched where it's been unpicked." He sniffed the lining. "Camphor and, lemon soap." "Household," Purbright murmured. "Indeed. And there, chalk marks, 42L. Tailor's chalk, not laundry. And this small rent near the seat, clumsily disguised with a safety pin hole." He looked up, pleased with the drama he could afford to disapprove. "A garment arranged to fail, Inspector." Back on the pavement, Love sounded both deflated and excited. So the river trousers weren't the Admiral's at all. Someone planted another pair dressed up as his humiliation. "Dressed down, perhaps," Purbright said, and his smile drifted. "Which leaves us two tasks, to discover where the Admiral's true trousers went, and to ask who benefits by substituting a different pair with a suggestive scrap in the pocket." "Hopcroft again?" Love ventured. He'd think it a lark, and he could manage a boat hook. The scarf. "Possibly," Purbright said, "but larks are rarely so diligent with wrappers and waistband stitches." They found Hopcroft in the chandlery, smelling of tar and varnish and youth. He grew eloquent under accusation, too eloquent, Purbright thought, insisting he'd been sent to the ferry by a woman's voice from the bridge. "Look along the rope, boy. There's something caught." Could he describe her? No, sir. She had gloves on and spoke like she was smiling through her teeth. He produced, with pride, a sixpence he said the voice had promised would be waiting at the ferry house window. There it had been, tucked under saucer, with a curl of lemon soap where someone's glove had rested. "Lemon," Love whispered as they stepped back into the daylight. "Soap is the great leveller of clues," Purbright said. "Half the respectable ladies in Flaxborough arm themselves in it. Still, a coin under a saucer is a civilized way to direct a boy. Our stage manager keeps tidy accounts." The Admiral's house, visited again that afternoon, was a study in affronted order. Mrs. Fudge received them on the threshold with a politeness tight enough to snap. She had the kind of hands that turned teacups into admonitions. In the dressing room, she stood while her husband scowled at a mirror, as though it were to blame. "My husband's wardrobe has been rifled," she said. "I said so yesterday. I say it again. The drawer for his ceremonial effects was not as he left it." "Anything missing beyond the trousers?" Purbright asked. "A travel sewing case," she said after a fractional pause. "It contains small things. Pins. The sort of men who never notice until they are needed." The Admiral flared. "You cannot possibly be suggesting that my wife—" "Sir," Purbright said gently, "I'm suggesting only that pins have a way of wandering, and sometimes they take reputations with them if no one calls them back." From the house, they went to Market Dern, where Raxter and Milson kept a tidy shop. The assistant, very anxious not to be thought the counsellor, explained that they indeed wrapped goods in heavy blue paper and scribbled notes in laundry pencil when redirecting deliveries. Yes, Admiral Fudge was a client. Last week a repair had come in and been returned. The seam of ceremonial trousers let out and restitched. The assistant produced the book, a line in neat hand, a check mark, a delivery tick initialed R&M. No docket with the counsellor's name. The shop, it appeared, wrote Raxter on everything they wrapped. "Do you recall who collected the Admiral's repair?" Purbright asked. "Sent by the house," the assistant said. "Not the maid. We know her. A messenger. Gloves," said Mrs. Fudge desired prompt return. "Gloves," Love murmured again, a little miserably. On the train back, the field slid past like sensible thoughts that refused to intrude. Love, who hated feeling the story move without him, said, "It points every way at once. At Hopcroft, at the wife, at the counsellor who isn't the shop, back to the shop that isn't the counsellor, and the trousers in the river aren't his. We're no nearer." "We are," Purbright said, watching Hedges. "We have exchanged a laugh for a method. The humiliation was prepared with pins, with hasty seams, with a planted slip that would misname a man in the public mind. A prank grows out of impulse. A method grows out of motive." "Whose motive?" "Consider who stopped laughing first," Purbright said. "The joke's author laughs longest. Those who hurry to anger or outrage have business to perform before the amusement spoils." By late afternoon, the town had done what it always did, boiled its facts down to a syrup of certainties. Mrs. Pilbeam declared she'd always suspected a woman's hand and named 3 who deserved it. The verger, with a theological neatness, argued that God would never permit so artful a pin to be wielded by anyone but a tailor. Dab, catching wind that the note might implicate a shop, rather than his rival, loudly revised his suspicions and accused commerce in general. Purbright returned to the station and laid the river trousers once more on the table. He took up a magnifier and traced the seat seam with its hurried unpicking. He weighed the waistband where the braces would have clipped and where a neatly twisted pin could have invited catastrophe the instant an orator drew breath. He looked again at the chalked 42L and the faint shadow where braid never lay, because braid had never been there. "Sergeant," he said at last, "we have been chasing a pair of trousers that are not the Admiral's, led by a name that is not a counsellor's, to convict a boy who is not a tailor's. It is time we asked a duller question. Which is? Where are the Admiral's real trousers?" As if the town had been waiting for the cue, a knock came at the door. Constable Hallam entered, hat in hand, excitement arranged into official sorrow. "Message from St. Swithin's, sir." The verger found a garment in the vestry chest under the spare hymnals, folded, with a smear of lemon soap on the waistband. "Looks like, well, ceremonial trousers. And there's this—" He set a second envelope on the desk. Inside lay a narrow strip of blue wrapper, torn cleanly, with a single penciled word in laundry blue. "Fudge." Love stared. "Hidden in the church." Purbright's gaze was very mild. A holy place for an unholy joke, or a careful one. He closed the envelope with a fingertip. It seems our method has moved indoors. St. Swithin's vestry had the hush of a place that expected to be trusted. The chest that held spare hymnals was older than its hinges and inclined to complain when lifted. The verger lifted it anyway, proudly revealing the neatly folded garment that had turned a regatta into a legend. Purbright did not touch the trousers at first. He leaned over them as one leans over a sleeping creature, observing the nap of the serge, the military braid along the seam, the faint oval smear at the waistband where lemon soap had kissed and dried. Beside the fold lay the narrow strip of blue wrapper, its torn edge clean, the laundry pencil making the single-penciled surname look almost official. Fudge. "Found under the hymn books, Inspector," the verger breathed, piety contending with satisfaction, as if Providence wished to keep them safe until the right eyes came. "Providence," Purbright said mildly, "is frequently mistaken for tidiness." He lifted the garment by 2 fingers, holding it to the vestry window. The light found a tiny crescent scar in the cloth at the back seam. No crude tear, but a place where a pin had once taken a deliberate bite. "And tidiness," he added, "for preparation." Sergeant Love noted the details with a schoolboy's zeal and an uneasy glance toward the nave where trestle tables were being arranged. The Mothers' Union had elected to hold its sale of work that afternoon rather than yield the day to scandal. Flaxborough believed in continuity. The click of teacups, the rustle of tissue, the candid snap of price tags being looped over items traveled through the vestry door like domestic weather. Purbright turned the trousers over, examined the inner waistband, and let them rest. "If these were hidden here before the regatta, we have one sort of culprit," he said. "If after, another. Either way, the chest does not open itself." "It was locked," the verger said, affronted on behalf of the keys. "But Mrs. Gribble borrowed it to fetch hymnals for last night's choir rehearsal, and Mrs. Catamole had it open in the morning to count programs. We are a busy parish." "Busyness," Purbright observed, "is the burglar's favorite alibi." Before Love could ask what precisely was meant, a ripple in the nave rose to a wave. Someone laughed, someone else hushed them, then came a chorus of delighted, scandalized squeals. The inspector and the sergeant stepped through the vestry door into sunlit indignation. The sale of work had drawn half the town. Mrs. Pilbeam presided at a table devoted to knitted tea-cozies that wore their baubles like battle honours. The organist, Mrs. Gribble, supervised a pile of lace runners with the severity of a customs officer. Councillors hovered near the sponge cakes as if proximity to charity would seep into their reputations by osmosis. At the far end, before a small crowd, a thin boy with choir hair had tugged a linen drop-cloth free of a display stand and revealed, pinned up with immaculate pedantry, a pair of ceremonial naval trousers. The effect was instantaneous and splendid. Gasps broke into laughter, which buckled into little screams of "oh" and "shame" and "don't look" for the benefit of those looking hardest. Admiral Fudge himself, who had been attempting to browse a table of marmalade without being noticed, went the color of a sunset through smoke. His mustache appeared to stiffen independently of his person. "Who put those there?" Mrs. Fudge demanded, each word sheared square. Mrs. Pilbeam, who dealt in certainty, declared, "They were donated, dear. Lot 42. She tapped a card tied to the waistband with a string. In a laundry pencil, on a square of thick paper torn from the corner of a wrapper, was written, with admirable confidence, 42L. Love made a small, involuntary sound. "Sir, yes," Purbright said, "a familiar measurement." He stepped closer. The little card carried a faint smear of lemon along one edge, as if a gloved thumb had smoothed it. 2 pinholes, placed very precisely through the paper just above the string, matched the crescent scar he had noticed in the cloth. The trousers themselves were authentic. Braid flawless, serge heavy, the waistband bearing the tailor's woven label where Mr. Blaine would have expected it to be. Only one thing jarred, The seat seam had been basted, then unpicked and re-sewn with haste. Work done in a hurry, confident only in the amount of laughter it would produce. Around them, the chorus of commentary rose and arranged itself into the usual chords. "Disgraceful to bring them into church," hissed the verger's wife. "It's a sign," murmured the verger, not to be outdone by his wife. "Racksters behind it," said a man from the ferry with the complacency of someone who likes his convenience strong. "Nonsense," snapped Councillor Dabb, plainly his wife. "Wives tidy up, too much tidying and look what you get." "Or the Admiral," Mrs. Pilbeam announced, eyes bright. "Men will do anything for attention." Purbright did not audition for their chorus. He leaned toward the choir boy who stood beside the display, enjoying the authority that comes of having tugged a cloth at the right moment. "Who asked you to reveal them, my lad?" "Mrs. Gribble said the stand mustn't be left empty," he replied, suddenly earnest. "So she told me to take off the cover when they rang the first bell and to smile." "Ah," said Purbright. Instruction and timing, the two friends of a well-kept joke. Mrs. Gribble materialized at his elbow, neat as a hem, her expression the injured innocence of a cat found in a cream jug. "Inspector, if that garment offends, it can be removed. It was brought in with a parcel for sale. I understood it to be a donation." "From whom?" asked Purbright, as mildly as one inquires the price of a gem. She gestured to the trestle where Mrs. Catamole sat with a ledger and a pencil so sharp it could have split hairs, and then charged for the service. The page lay open at a column of offerings. Purbright read down the neat entries. Doilies, a set of teaspoons, 2 jars of chutney, until he reached naval trousers, ceremonial, 1, donor, E. Rackster. There was a small gravity in the space that followed the name, as if the pencil itself had paused to wonder. Love let out his breath. Admiral Fudge, who had been leaning toward outrage, straightened with the puzzled dignity of a man whose humiliation had acquired a pedigree. "Mrs. Rackster?" he said, and his mustache made an astonished tick. "I wrote what I was told," Mrs. Catamole said briskly. "The parcel was blue-wrapped, quite properly done. Lady presented it with gloves and said Mrs. Rackster sends this along from the club. I asked which club. She said frankly, the one that minds its own. I took that to mean the naval ladies." "And you did not ask who the lady herself was?" Purbright asked, not unkindly. "She had a veil," Mrs. Catamole said, indicating the world's supply of veils. At which point the Admiral found speech. "This is an outrage. Rackster's household smuggles my trousers into the house of God, pins them up like bunting, and expects to be thanked for charity." "Charity," Purbright remarked, "is often at its busiest when reputation is on the table." He turned the little card in his fingers. "Observe, Sergeant, the hand on the number is not Mrs. Catamole's. She crosses her fingers open. This writer closes them tight. And the L, a tailor's note, not a churchwoman's. Someone prepared the tag elsewhere and delivered the lot complete." Mrs. Gribble tightened. "If you imply that I imply nothing," Purbright said, with the courtesy that feels like a door held open for a gust of doubt. "I observe. Observation is less expensive to all concerned." He examined the waistband again, then raised his head. "May I see the donation book for last week's collections at the vestry door?" "You shall," the verger said, who liked nothing better than to produce a book in answer to a remark. He fetched it with speed and self-importance, and Purbright turned to the day before the regatta. There, in a less neat hand than Mrs. Catamole's, a line read, "Parcel left for Mother's Union. Collect after practice." Initials, hurried and almost an afterthought. E.R. the organist's hand, Love whispered. Mrs. Gribble colored faintly. "I put down what I was told. I assumed it meant evening rehearsal." "We are not all clerks, Sergeant." The air in the nave altered by a degree. It was not quite suspicion, not yet, but it had turned to examine Mrs. Gribble's gloves with interest. Outside, the hour bell tolled, committing the scene to memory. Purbright let the trousers fall to his arm as though they weighed a human worry. "It appears," he said, almost to himself, that the Admiral's dignity came to church by invitation, and not necessarily the one written in the ledger. He looked past the crowd to the doorway where a figure had paused, a woman in a neat hat, veil lowered, gloved hands resting on a parcel no bigger than a hymn book. She watched the assembled scandal as a gardener might watch an experiment bloom. When she saw Purbright looking, she turned away, not in haste but with the measured calm of someone keeping to a timetable. Love made to follow, but Purbright touched his sleeve. "Number, let the act end," he said softly. "One learns more from the curtain call than the performance." The Admiral demanded custody of his property. Mrs. Fudge demanded satisfaction from whoever had loaned it to charity. Mrs. Pilbeam demanded to know whether the Mothers' Union proposed to raffle naval garments as a regular feature. In the ledger, the line with E. Raxter sat like a pinned butterfly, utterly still and implausibly bright. The sale resumed in fragments, scandal rising and falling like a hymn sung in the wrong key. Back in the vestry, Purbright laid the trousers beside the blue wrapper slip and the river pair, their differences now as plain as their resemblance had once been. "We are offered," he said, "a new suspect who is also an old convenience. Councillor Raxter is a noisy man, Mrs. Raxter is not. Silence makes a finer, instrument love frowned. Do you believe she sent them?" "I believe," Purbright said, "that whoever did so understands that a name written properly will always be believed above a name rightly spoken, especially when written in laundry blue." He closed the evidence envelope with his thumb. "And I believe our playwright has a fondness for churches." A tap at the vestry door announced the verger again, more excited than before. "Inspector, I found something else. Behind the hymn board this time. Stuck with wax. A little paper, folded thrice. It says, 'Stand for the last verse. Do not laugh.' And on the back, this is the odd part, it's stamped from Market Dern Ladies' Naval Circle." Purbright smiled, a slow, rueful curve. "Instruction and timing," he repeated. "Our joke keeps its manners." He looked toward the nave where the last of the tea had been drunk and the last of the indignation saved for later. "We have moved from prank to program, Sergeant, and programs, you will have noticed, carry sponsors." By the time the Mothers' Union folded its tablecloths and counted the jam money, the town had decided what the ledger had only hinted. E. Raxter might as well have been written in trumpet notes. The name traveled faster than common sense. In the High Street, it was pronounced with relish. In the post office, with prim disappointment. In the Black Swan, with a cheer. That it appeared in laundry pencil on a blue scrap. That a veiled woman had said the words and not signed them. That the tag's figures had been written by a hand unknown. These were details for later, when the story had exhausted itself. For now, Mrs. Raxter, who had never sought a stage, found herself given one. Purbright, who preferred audiences for music rather than accusation, let the tide run for an hour and then walked Sergeant Love to the Market Dern Ladies' Naval Circle. The room they were shown bore pennants and a polish that threatened to outlast the century. Miss Tansley, the Circle's spare, conscientious secretary, produced the stamp that had sealed the instruction note discovered behind the hymn board. She handled it with the reverence due a sacrament and the fretfulness due a borrowed item. "We keep it locked," she said, "for programs and notices. It went out twice this week. Once for the whist drive flyers, Mrs. Raxter's request, and once, I believe, to Mrs. Gribble for the choir's naval hymn evening." "Mrs. Gribble?" Love repeated, surprised to hear the organist's name sung in a different key. "For 2 days," Miss Tansley said, consulting a card. "She returned it yesterday morning. I would have preferred yesterday afternoon. The key to the cabinet is not an elastic." She gave a prim smile to show she could joke, but only around locks. Purbright turned the stamp in his fingers, considered its very ordinariness, and asked to see the Circle's borrowing book. He scanned the tidy columns, each entry an admission of harmless intent, until he reached the 2 names. "Did either lady also take wrappers?" he asked. "Wrappers?" Miss Tansley blinked. "We have none. The outfitters have wrappers." "Quite," Purbright murmured, "and the outfitters write Raxter on everything they own." From there, they called at Raxter House, where Mrs. Raxter received them in a parlor that smelt of beeswax and lavender, the air held together by a discipline that never raised its voice. She was a small woman who had taught her hats to sit properly and her opinions to be economical. If the gossip had reached her, it had not moved the furniture. "I'm told my name was used," she said, and her voice made the statement an observation rather than a complaint. "I have long suspected that my name is more convenient than my person." Love's pencil trembled with eagerness. "Madame, did you donate the Admiral's trousers to the sale of work?" "No," she said simply. "I sent books to the Mothers' Union last week. Maritime memoirs for their jumble table. I stamped the parcel, yes. The Circle encourages proper branding, but the contents were paper, not serge." She indicated a neat pile of postal receipts kept with the fussiness of a woman who refuses to argue with memory. "The whist drive occupied my evening, the hairdresser my morning. Mrs. Plowright will tell you that my set resists the calendar, unless I attend it with devotion." Purbright, who trusted hairdressers more than alibis, asked for a telephone number. It was supplied at once. He let the conversation drift across safer ground. On a side table, a small needlebook lay open, its thread neatly waxed. He saw in the wax a faint citrus line, as though somebody's good housekeeping had embraced lemon. He also saw that the threaded needle had left stitches in a linen hem so perfect they seemed drawn rather than sewn. "Your hand is precise, madam," he said, "far more so than the basting we saw unpicked on a certain seam." She looked up. "Imprecision is for those who have time to waste. I'm not among them." Then, after a beat that might have been a concession, "You will be told that I dislike the Admiral." "I do not. I dislike noise. The difference is lost on those who enjoy both." When she wrote down the hairdresser's number, Purbright watched the figures. Her fours opened like little doorways. The 42L on the donation tag had closed its four tight, as though it feared a draft. He folded the paper away without remark. Outside, Love exhaled. "If she is guilty, sir, she has the best manners for it." "If she is guilty, Sergeant, she would not have lent us her alibi. Vanity makes a noise. Discipline keeps records." Purbright looked down the crescent of the street. "Let us listen to the records." Mrs. Plowright, hairdresser and keeper of receipts, had no patience for scandal except when it booked appointments. She consulted a small ledger as neat as a hymn. "Mrs. Raxter, 9:30 until 10:15 on the morning in question. Before that, Mrs. Dabb at 9 talking about her husband's lungs and the Admiral's legs. I made a note not to seat her under the window again. After Mrs. Raxter, choir practice, I do a special rate for altos." "And the night before?" Purbright asked. "Whist drive, Church Hall," she said. "She sold tickets until 10. I know because I set her hair to last into the card game. A curl must manage its own innings at such functions." "Thank you," Purbright said, as though an arrangement of curlers had just solved a displacement of trousers. In a town like Flaxborough, it often had. Word of the inspector's visit performed its usual embroidery on the way home. By tea-time, Mrs. Raxter had been both exonerated by a hairdo and condemned by it. By closing time, the bridge club had sworn she could not possibly have tied a parcel, never mind a scandal, while winning a hand with 3 queens. The truth shifted in the air like a scent, noticed and then denied. In the middle of this, Dabb found a barrel and climbed it. He stood in the market, booming about propriety and houses built on sand, and if his phrases did not entirely meet, the crowd joined them for him. He called upon Councillor Raxter to denounce his wife until the call became an accusation of his rival's manhood for failing to do so. Mrs. Pilbeam nodded through it with the contentment of a woman whose afternoon had not been wasted. That evening, Purbright returned to St. Swithin's with love and a key that opened more than a vestry chest. The verger, flattered into useful memory, admitted that Mrs. Gribble had indeed borrowed the Naval Circle stamp, that a small parcel, blue-wrapped, had appeared on the vestry bench during choir practice, and that the organist had asked the choir boy to do his bit at the sale of work because timing matters. "Does it?" Purbright asked, and the question had the softness of a towel that dries while revealing the grain of the wood beneath. They searched not for trousers now, but for the habits that had delivered them. Behind the organ bench, Love found a curl of wax fallen into a crack, pale lemon when warmed between finger and thumb. In the drawer where the choir kept their pins, there was one with a bent tip that remembered a waistband and refused to straighten. On the back of an unused hymn list, folded small, a note: "Remove cloth at first bell. Smile." The letters were printed carefully in laundry blue, their fours shut tight against the weather. "Organists," Love said, half apology and half accusation. "Organists are useful," Purbright said. "They practice with timing, manage volunteers, and believe the world goes more sweetly if it follows their steps." He slid the note into an envelope. "But we have promised the town a villain and given them a lady. We must let that play out long, enough to teach us who keeps the applause." The next morning, the debate ripened. The Admiral, in full voice, called at the council offices and demanded an apology from any Raxter who answers to the name. Councillor Raxter announced that his household would not dignify slander, and then dignified it by defending his wife in terms that made her sound like a charitable institution. Mrs. Raxter did not speak at all. The silence was taken as hauteur by those who disliked her, and as innocence by those who envied her hats. Purbright took one small public step and one private. The public step was to ask, in the hearing of those who collect questions, whether anyone had seen Mrs. Raxter carry a parcel to the church. No one had, which satisfied both camps. The private step was to telephone Mrs. Plowright and ask whether lemon wax had ever entered her establishment. "Never," she said with heat. "Citrus dries the scalp." That, to Purbright, was a sermon. By late afternoon, a messenger arrived from the vestry carrying a discovery wrapped in tissue, a narrow travel sewing case, the sort that keeps its own order with quiet pride. Inside were needles, a few coarse basting threads, and a single safety pin with a memory of starch on the tongue. On the flap, someone had inked initials, faded with years of careful fingers. E.G. Love stared. "Gribble," he whispered. "Or any other E.G. in the parish," Purbright said kindly. He closed the case and held it a moment as if listening. "A joke sets its own lighting cues, Sergeant. One looks for the person who likes the dimmer switches." That evening, as the verger locked the church, a gust lifted a corner of the notice on the board. Purbright flattened it and felt beneath. Another sliver of blue paper, stuck with a trace of wax, its corner torn as neatly as a thought. He peeled it free. In laundry blue, a hand had practiced a signature, ER-, the tail unfinished, the habit of a writer who prefers to complete names at the moment of presentation. He stood a while, the nave long and calm before him, the town's verdict bustling somewhere beyond the doors. Then he folded the silver away and said, not loudly, but as if to the building itself, "Names, Sergeant, are garments. Some people wear them, others pin them on." The sewing case lay on Purbright's desk like a relic from some modest shrine, its initials faint but legible. E.G. to Flaxborough, that was proof enough. For the town required very little encouragement to transform coincidence into conviction. By the time the Evening Post delivered its letters, it was already known that Mrs. Gribble had orchestrated the Admiral's downfall, that she had played the hymn wrong at last year's harvest festival, that she had once quarrelled with Mrs. Fudge over the purchase of a new organ stool, that she was a woman inclined to strong views. All these recollections rose to the surface, polished into evidence by repetition. Sergeant Love, however, was less than convinced. "If she did it, sir, why leave her own initials? No criminal writes their name on the weapon." Purbright, who was examining the safety pin from the sewing case under a magnifying lens, answered mildly, "Not unless they want to be caught, or want someone else to be." He turned the pin between his fingers. "Notice, Sergeant, the residue on the clasp. Traces of starch and perhaps wax. It has visited the same companions as our slips of wrapper. The initials may be genuine or borrowed. Either way, they are part of the program." Their next call was to St. Swithin's, where Mrs. Gribble was supervising the choir boys with her usual severity. She stood at the organ like a general at his maps, issuing commands that brooked no question. When Purbright raised the matter of the sewing case, she fixed him with a look designed to shrink lesser men into contrition. "That case was stolen from me 2 years ago," she said crisply. "From the vestry, during a jumble. I said so at the time, but the verger preferred to think I'd mislaid it. I mislay nothing. If it has turned up now, it has been planted for mischief. I will not have my good name compromised by haberdashery." Love, eager to corner her, asked whether she had borrowed the Naval Circle's stamp. "Of course," she said without hesitation. "I was preparing programs for our naval hymn evening. The stamp was returned intact. If some wag has used it to scribble notes about trousers, then that is their own degradation, not mine." She dismissed them with a chord that rattled the stained glass. Love muttered as they left, "She's prickly enough to be guilty." "Prickliness," Purbright observed, "is usually evidence of bruising, not striking. A woman who speaks that plainly does not also smuggle notes behind hymn boards. We must listen to the choir instead." They found the boys in the yard, kicking a ball against the vestry wall with holy enthusiasm. When asked, one lad admitted that during practice the week before, Mrs. Gribble had stepped out for several minutes to speak to a lady in a veil who had entered the church. He thought the lady carried a parcel. He remembered, too, that Mrs. Gribble had scolded him afterwards for humming out of turn. Love seized on it. The veiled woman again. Always a parcel, always at the right moment. Couldn't it be Mrs. Raxter after all, trying to look like someone else? Purbright watched the boys scatter the ball across the cobbles. Perhaps. But veils are a language spoken by more than one mouth in this town. It is not the veil that matters, Sergeant, but the stage on which it appears. The stage for the next act presented itself sooner than expected. That evening, the Flaxborough Choral Society held its rehearsal in the town hall. Choir practice was usually of interest only to those involved, but the events of the regatta had swelled the audience. Half the town seemed to have come, under the pretext of supporting culture, though in truth they hoped to see Mrs. Gribble topple from her stool in disgrace. The rehearsal began with the hymn "For Those in Peril on the Sea," a choice that caused more titters than reverence. Yet midway through the verse, a rustle passed through the audience. From beneath the piano stool, someone had drawn out another pair of trousers, folded, tagged, pinned with laundry blue. They were not the Admiral's this time, but belonged unmistakably to Councillor Dabb, as proved by the monogram stitched in the waistband. The discovery produced pandemonium, laughter, shouts, accusations. Each voice fought to be the loudest. Dabb leapt to his feet, crimson and perspiring, shouting that this was treachery, that his enemies sought to ruin him, that he would resign before enduring another minute of mockery. The choir boys, delighted, howled with glee. Purbright retrieved the trousers calmly, noting the familiar neat fold, the wrapper tag marked in blue. Dabb, 40S. Once again, the fours were closed tight, and once again, a faint lemon smear traced the edge. Love whispered, astonished, "It's spreading, sir." First the Admiral, now Dabb. Who'll be next? Purbright held the garment up to the light. Our playwright has enlarged the cast. The Admiral's disgrace was an overture. The Councillor's is the second act. He paused, the faintest sigh escaping. Flaxborough does love a serial. The crowd outside the hall swelled into gossip before the choir had finished its hymn. By the time the lamps were lit, the whole town was discussing not only the Admiral's missing trousers, but Dab's public exposure and whether others would be stripped metaphorically or literally before the farce ended. Names were offered freely: the mayor, the verger, even Purbright himself. Back in his office, the inspector laid the second pair beside the first. "Observe, Sergeant. Identical preparation. Fold, pin, tag, lemon. This is no prank stretched thin. It is a design with room for more victims." Love shook his head. "But why? Who profits by making fools of half the town?" "Those who profit," Purbright said softly, "are not always those who laugh. Sometimes, Sergeant, laughter is only the curtain that hides the stage machinery." He let the silence settle before adding, "The false suspect has emerged, as it was meant to. The town is certain of Mrs. Raxter, then Mrs. Gribble, now Councillor Dab. Each accusation draws us away from the hand behind the curtain, and each accusation arrives with perfect timing." Love wrote it down, though doubt furrowed his brow. "So what do we do now, sir?" "We wait," Purbright replied, folding the trousers neatly once more. "The author of this play has promised a third act. Let us see who stands center stage when the curtain rises again." Outside, Flaxborough's windows glowed with speculation, each parlor rehearsing its own theory, each neighbor adding an embellishment, and somewhere among them the unseen hand that had stitched seams, folded cloth, and slipped blue slips into pockets was already preparing the next scene. The choral rehearsal scandal was scarcely digested before Flaxborough was summoned to a greater feast of outrage. The council, rattled by Councillor Dab's trousers being found beneath a piano stool, called an emergency meeting in the town hall to restore confidence and order. To the townsfolk, this meant another opportunity for spectacle. By dusk, the square was thronged with men in caps and women in summer frocks, jostling for a place in the gallery. It had the air of a theatre audience awaiting a farce in 3 acts, though few would admit as much. Inside, the chamber was stifling with heat and anticipation. The mayor, already damp with nerves, called the meeting to order. Councillor Dab, still indignant, was determined to denounce his enemies. Councillor Raxter sat upright, eyes flashing, ready to answer in kind. Admiral Fudge attended as well, mustache bristling like a banner of war, demanding the restoration of naval dignity. Purbright and Love sat unobtrusively in the back row, watching as voices rose and collided like poorly steered boats. Dab thundered about sabotage, blaming an organized conspiracy to humiliate the pillars of this town. He jabbed a finger toward Raxter's bench, demanding to know whether his rival had plotted not only against himself, but against the Admiral. Raxter sprang up, righteous indignation radiating like a halo, declaring he had been slandered by petticoat intrigue, and that his household would never stoop to such vulgar tricks. The chamber buzzed with murmurs, the gallery straining for each word, and then, just as the mayor raised his gavel in a futile attempt at calm, a commotion began at the rear doors. 2 constables entered, bearing a third pair of trousers, folded, tagged, and presented like an offering. A ripple of excitement passed through the crowd, then broke into gasps as the tag was read aloud, "Mayor, 38R." The mayor staggered, nearly dropping his gavel. His face, which had been merely anxious, turned the color of weak porridge. Laughter erupted from the gallery, followed by a chorus of scandalized cries. "3 in a row," shouted one man. "Who's next?" another demanded. The room dissolved into bedlam, council business forgotten. Love leaned closer to Purbright, whispering in awe, "It's spreading like an epidemic. Admiral Dab, now the mayor. Whoever's behind this, they've got half the town in their sights." Purbright accepted the garment from the constables with calm detachment, examining the tag in laundry blue. "And again, Sergeant, our author writes his numbers with closed fores. The same hand, the same lemon wax along the fold, the same neat preparation. What appears as an accident is in fact continuity. It is theatre, carefully staged. He opened the waistband to reveal not only the mayor's monogram, but a slip tucked within. Another torn fragment of blue wrapper bearing the penciled letters G.C. Love blinked at it. "Who's that, sir? A new name?" "Not new," Purbright said softly. "Merely late in joining the program. We must wait and see whether Flaxborough supplies the rest of the syllables for us." The meeting collapsed into farce. Councillors shouted over one another. The mayor declared himself the victim of vile subversion, and Admiral Fudge demanded the culprit be court-martialed. Outside, the square roared with fresh gossip, the crowd repeating the revelation before the ink of memory had dried. By nightfall, it was accepted truth that a secret society of women, perhaps the ladies' naval circle, was plotting to disgrace the town's men by parading their trousers in public. The theory was embroidered with relish. Some swore the garments were stolen during fittings at the laundry, others that they had been borrowed during charitable collections. Every story grew legs faster than the trousers had lost them. Back in the station, Purbright laid the 3 pairs side by side. The Admiral's ceremonial trousers, Dab's monogrammed pair, and the mayor's formal dress slacks. Each bore the same signs of tampering. Seams unpicked then resewn, tags written in identical hand, faint lemon wax along the folds. "A single tailor," Purbright said softly, "dressing the whole cast." Love, pacing, said, "But why these men? What ties them together, except the council? The Admiral's honorary, but he's still one of them. Could it be revenge against the council itself?" "Perhaps," Purbright allowed. "Or perhaps the council is the stage and humiliation the script. We must look not at the actors but at the audience, who laughs most and who laughs least. That is where authorship lies." They traced the chain of custody for the mayor's trousers. He had left them in his dressing room the night before, intending to wear them for the meeting. In the morning, they were gone, replaced by a substitute pair. His wife swore she had not touched them. The maid protested innocence. The only unusual occurrence, she admitted, was a woman at the door claiming to be from the church, collecting for the Mothers' Union. She wore gloves, a veil, and carried a parcel already wrapped. The maid remembered her perfume, sharp, lemony. Love exhaled. The veiled woman again. "She's everywhere." "Everywhere," Purbright repeated, "and yet never named. A role rather than a person, which makes her more dangerous. A role can be played by anyone who knows the lines." The inspector returned to the evidence table, where the trousers lay like discarded costumes. He lifted the mayor's pair and studied the chalk marks inside the waistband. Again the notation 38R in closed fours, again the faint impression of tailor's chalk, again the same. Coarse thread used to resew the seam. He replaced them gently. "Sergeant," he said, "we must resist the temptation to chase veils. Veils are for concealment, but threads are for joining, and whoever stitches these seams has left us their thread to follow." Outside, Flaxborough was already scripting the next act. Some said the vicar would be the next victim, others the verger, others still the inspector himself. Bets were laid in the Black Swan, theories exchanged in the post office, and warnings whispered over garden fences. For the townsfolk, the scandal had become a sport, and every man of standing was a potential quarry. But Purbright, walking home with Love in the misty evening, spoke only one line, quiet as a refrain. "When the stage grows larger, Sergeant, it is not for laughter, but for revelation. The play will tell us its author soon enough." By the following morning, the scandal had lost none of its momentum, though the names involved had shifted like pieces on a board. Now it was the mayor who walked with his head lowered, and his wife who answered the door with a crispness that discouraged sympathy. Councillor Dab remained furious, convinced of a conspiracy aimed personally at his downfall. Admiral Fudge, meanwhile, had taken to patrolling the high street in full uniform, mustache stiff, daring anyone to laugh in his presence. Flaxborough did not oblige him, of course. Laughter is not so easily disciplined. Purbright knew that facts, unlike gossip, had no audience unless coaxed. And so he began the day not in the square, where tongues wagged without pause, but in the homes of those who had so far been cast as unwilling players. Each visit was a quiet excavation of character, for motives are stitched not into events, but into people. Mrs. Fudge received him with tight civility. Her husband, she said, was humiliated beyond repair and spoke of nothing but honor. Yet her eyes, cool and steady, betrayed a deeper irritation. "It is not the loss of trousers that wounds him," she said, "but the loss of command. He was accustomed to being laughed at privately. It is the public nature of it that has undone him." She looked toward the Admiral, who stood in the garden berating a gardener for planting begonias too close together. He is a man who prefers applause to silence. Laughter confuses him. When Purbright asked if she suspected anyone, she did not hesitate. It will be one of his own circle. He has collected enemies in the way some collect stamps. The council delights in cutting down those who preen. My own view. Raxter enjoys theatre too much to resist arranging one. From there, Purbright and Love called upon Mrs. Dabb, who was a woman of perpetual complaint, but also of sharp memory. "My husband is ruined," she declared at once. "To be associated with trousers under a piano is social death. And you may write down that I blame Mrs. Gribble. She has never forgiven me for saying the harvest hymn was played too slowly. She seeks revenge in fabric. Mark my words." Love wrote it down, though Purbright simply asked, "And did you see anything unusual, Mrs. Dabb, before the meeting?" She pursed her lips, then admitted that a parcel had been delivered to her house 3 days earlier. It was wrapped in heavy blue paper and left at the doorstep. She assumed it was from the outfitter. When her husband opened it, however, he found only an old pair of trousers. Not his own, but similar. He dismissed it as a prank and threw them out. She, however, remembered the scent. "Lemon," she said firmly, as if the paper had been polished with soap. Their next call was on the mayor's wife, who had the weary dignity of one too practiced in smoothing her husband's disarray. She insisted that the trousers taken from the town hall were indeed his, for she had pressed them herself the week before. Yet her voice carried no outrage, only resignation. "The town will talk itself hoarse and then move on," she said. "But in the meantime, every neighbor will treat me as though I personally placed them under the constable's noses. My husband insists it is political. I think it is entertainment, and I will not forgive those who confuse the two." Love, sensing her bitterness, asked softly, "Do you think he had enemies enough for such cruelty?" She looked at him with the faintest smile. "Inspector, every man in public office has enemies enough for cruelty. Some acquire them by governing, some by gossip. My husband has earned his through incompetence. It is an inexhaustible supply." As they left, Love whispered, "She despises him." "Despising and destroying are not the same," Purbright replied. "One is common, the other requires art." That afternoon, they returned to the laundry, where Mrs. Bayliss produced her records with relish. She had traced each wrapper scrap that had passed through her establishment. 2 had gone to Mrs. Gribble for choir materials, 3 to Mrs. Raxter for her whist drive parcel, and 1, curiously, to Mrs. Pilbeam, who had requested paper for her household purposes. Purbright asked what those might be. Mrs. Bayliss pursed her lips. "She said lining drawers, but I have never known Mrs. Pilbeam to line anything but her own pockets." Love brightened. "So Mrs. Pilbeam could be our veiled woman." "Possibly," Purbright said, "but she would be the first veiled woman in history to keep her tongue still while arranging mischief. And that, Sergeant, is improbable." Still, the name went into the notebook. Toward evening, they visited the church once more. The choir boys, emboldened by recent excitement, were eager to share. One claimed he had seen the veiled woman slip a parcel into the hymn chest. Another swore he had heard her laugh softly before disappearing through the vestry door. A third insisted she had dropped a glove, though when pressed, he admitted it had been a lady's glove found weeks earlier in the churchyard. Purbright listened patiently, then asked each boy who had first told the story. Inevitably, the finger pointed to another boy. Gossip, like trousers, could be passed from hand to hand without ever belonging to the one who carried it. That night, Purbright sat long in his office, the evidence spread before him. Trousers folded like accusations, tags scrawled in laundry blue, scraps of wrapper faint with lemon. Each pointed to a different suspect, and each arrived with theatrical precision. Yet the inspector's gaze lingered not on the cloth, but on the handwriting. Closed fours, tight, deliberate, consistent. A hand that liked order but not flourish. A hand used to writing instructions, not letters. "Sergeant," he said at last, "our culprit has not only stitched trousers, but also stitched character. These garments are not designed merely to humiliate, but to reveal. Each victim tells us more about themselves and about who might wish to parade them. We must not chase garments, but people. We must ask, not whose trousers are missing, but whose patience has worn through." Love, tired but attentive, nodded. "Then tomorrow, sir, we talk to the one who has lost patience." Purbright extinguished the lamp, his mind already measuring the threads that tied character to motive. Outside, Flaxborough slept uneasily, its dreams punctuated by laughter and whispers, as though the town itself rehearsed lines for a play still unfolding. By afternoon, the town had arranged its evening entertainment under the respectable name of Charity. The market, Dern Ladies' Naval Circle. Whist Drive promised cakes, prizes, and a short patriotic tableau, which was Flaxborough's way of saying there would be something to talk about tomorrow. The town hall smelled of polish and icing sugar. Tables were set with cards and pencils. A trestle at the far end bore a pyramid of raffle hampers wrapped in blue paper, each tied with a white ribbon as crisp as a salute. A score slate hung by the door, chalked in firm, tidy figures. Purbright's gaze lingered a second. Fours closed tight as if guarding themselves from drafts. Miss Tansley, the circle's secretary, moved about with quiet efficiency, placing pencils, straightening programs, smoothing a corner of bunting. If the past week had disturbed her, no crease showed. She greeted Purbright with conscientious courtesy and produced, unasked, a copy of the evening's order. "We follow the book, Inspector," she said. "Disorder is not patriotic." "Few things are," Purbright murmured. Love, who had been conscripted into selling raffle tickets and had already bought 2 of his own by mistake, leaned toward his superior. "Look at those figures on the slate, sir. Same hand as the tags, I'd swear." "Not swear," Purbright said mildly. "Observe. Swearing is for those who wish to be believed. Observing is for those who wish to be right." The whist began, with the solemnity of a rite. Cards shuffled, chairs scraped, whispers ticked like small clocks. The Admiral entered late in full uniform, his moustache at attention, Mrs. Fudge on his arm like a reprimand. Councillor Dabb arrived in a suit that tried to appear unflustered. The mayor slipped in through a side door and attempted invisibility behind a palm. The organist, Mrs. Gribble, took a seat near the front and fixed the proceedings with the unblinking attention of someone who suspects the tempo will be wrong and intends to be first to say so. Between rubbers, Miss Tansley mounted the dais to announce prizes in her precise voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, the grand consolation will be drawn at 9. Please keep your tickets. Do not fold them. Numbers must be legible." She wrote GC 9 o'clock on the slate, the chalk fours closing firmly, and moved on to adjust the bow of a hamper as if tidying were a kind of prayer. "GC?" Love whispered. "Like the letters we found in the mayor's waistband." "Grand consolation," Purbright said. A note meant for a slate wandered into a pocket. "Not a person, Sergeant. A timetable." The first tableau proved to be a patriotic banner unfurled by two girls in sailor hats. It bore the words, "For those in peril on the sea," appliqued with enthusiasm and an iron. The audience murmured its approval. The banner drooped a little, then lifted as if reconsidering. A pin had been placed very exactly to fail at a theatrical moment, and the cloth obeyed. A twitter ran around the hall. The second tableau, Britannia, local, was postponed when Britannia's spear went astray behind the stage curtains. No one minded. Flaxborough adored a mishap that arrived on cue. At 5 to 9, Miss Tansley rapped a pencil against the dais. "Grand Consolation," she announced. "Ticket 214. She wrote it on the slate as she spoke. A 2 like a swan, 4s shut like doors, a 1 that marched upright. A murmur. The Admiral's number was 215. He looked wounded by proximity. A boy fetched the winning hamper from the pyramid, the white ribbon shining, the blue paper neat as a uniform. The winner, a modest woman from the post office, untied the ribbon, peeled the paper lemon in the air again, just for a breath, and opened the box. On the top lay tissue, under it a folded thing, the color of midnight with a braid along the seam. For a beat, the room held its breath in pure, perverse delight. Then, before the laughter could break, Purbright was already at the woman's side, lifting the garment as though it were hot. "Not tonight," he said gently, and something in his tone persuaded the room to swallow what it wished to shout. He laid the trousers across his arm, examined the tag written in laundry blue, "GC Winner 900, and the small instruction card beneath, stamped with the Naval Circle's device. "Stand for the last verse. Do not laugh." Love stared. "It's the same." "Hand, sir. The same wax, the same everything." "And the same program," Purbright replied. "Our author repeats himself because the audience is new." A rustle near the stage. A rope twitched. The patriotic banner, as if having waited for its cue, flew up to reveal, pinned along its bottom edge like bunting, 3 narrow strips of blue wrapper, each neatly torn. On one, "Dab." On another, "Mayor." On the third, incomplete, "Rax Dash." The room gasped, then gave way. Laughter collapsed into outrage, outrage into applause, applause into a chorus of accusations in which each person tried to be the cleverest. "Shame," cried someone. "Outrage," cried another. "Encore," cried a third, less helpful. The mayor sprang up, livid. "This is sabotage of public dignity," Dab thundered about conspiracies. The Admiral drew himself to his full height and declared that the enemy had infiltrated the home front. Mrs. Pilbeam demanded to know whether the trousers were for sale and, if so, whether the Mothers' Union would get a percentage. Through it all, Miss Tansley stood very straight, her hands folded, her face set to duty. She rapped the pencil again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will have quiet. The Grand Consolation is a prize, not a provocation." It was the sort of sentence that ought to have worked. It almost did. People settled by increments, like feathers after a cushion has been struck. Purbright turned the trousers. This pair was not the Admiral's. The braid was woven, but the labels showed the mare's tailor. The seam inside had been unpicked and hastily resewn with the coarse thread he knew by now, as well as any signature. He touched the tag again. The 4s had that same tightness, not crabbed but enclosed, as if the writer disapproved of wasted air. "Sir," Love whispered, eyes on the slate. "Look at the scores Miss Tansley is writing. 44, 24, those 4s. And the way she abbreviates. GC for Grand Consolation. Same as the slip we found." "Observation," Purbright said, "is the beginning of memory." He watched Miss Tansley correct a smudge of chalk with a folded handkerchief. When she put it away, he glimpsed its edge, a faint oval of lemon along the hem where a glove might have pressed wax. Her reticule lay open beside the slate. Inside was a small tin, no larger than a matchbox, its lid labelled lemon polish, stamps and seals. A burst of commotion. Someone had pulled the stage rope again, whether in mischief or to help. The lights dimmed, flickered, and went out. A collective "oh" swelled and ebbed. In the darkness, a chair scraped, a door clicked. The hall smelled suddenly and freshly of lemon. Love fumbled for his torch. Purbright's was already lit, low and obliging. He held it down, not up, letting it find what feet ignored. A pin glinting by the dais, a blue pencil fallen under the slate, a thread of coarse basting trailing like a breadcrumb. When the lights stumbled back to life, Miss Tansley was at the stage curtain, calm, composed, her tin now shut. "Fuse," she said. "They are unreliable." "Like audiences," Purbright replied. The room, having tasted darkness, became more fervent in its demand for revelation. Dabb insisted on searching the hampers. The Admiral called for names. The Mayor threatened resignations that sounded suspiciously like invitations. Mrs. Gribble rose and declared she would not have the church's efforts made ridiculous by parlour games. The crowd applauded whatever part of that sentiment suited them. Purbright lifted the instruction card again. "Stand for the last verse. Do not laugh." He turned it over. On the back, in tiny letters, "Return stamped by 10." The circle's device sat above the words like a chaperone. He stepped to the dais, as unobtrusively as a man can when he is the only person in a room not rearranging their indignation. "Miss Tansley," he said, "may I see your minute book?" She blinked. For the drive," he said pleasantly. "One admires a meeting that runs on time. I wish to learn from it." She hesitated, as a good secretary hesitates when the page is not as neat as her reputation, then handed him a thin ledger. He opened it where the ribbon lay. The hand inside was small and exact. "GC 9 o'clock, he read. "Banner. Cue at first bell. Instruct boy. Do not laugh." The fours closed tight. The letters in laundry blue, though here in pencil, retained their particular cramped propriety. At the bottom of the page, a list of borrowings, checked off with a tiny tick. Stamp, returned by 10. Wax, tin. Pins, vestry drawer. Wrapper, R&M offcuts, bayless. Sewing case, borrowed, e.g. Love drew in a breath. The words were not confession, they were competence. Purbright returned the book with a small bow, as if receiving a psalm. "You keep excellent minutes, Miss Tansley." "A secretary must," she said. She had not coloured. Her eyes did not quite meet his. "Is there anything improper in a timetable?" "Nothing," Purbright said, "unless time itself is being used as a weapon." The last tableau, delayed beyond a joke, unfolded in a muddle of applause and complaint. The hall began to empty, its scandal carefully packed in a paper to be unwrapped at breakfast tables. In the doorway, the veiled woman paused, exactly as she had at the Mothers' Union sale. Only now the veil was not quite low enough to hide the set of the mouth or the fractional lift of a chin that had learned to refuse nonsense politely. She slipped out before Love's hand found the doorframe. "We've seen enough, sir," Love said, half triumphant, half uncertain. "Haven't we?" "We have seen a hand," Purbright said softly. "Whether it belongs to an author or a copyist remains to be learned. But we have our thread, Sergeant. And threads, as I've mentioned, are not for hiding." He glanced once more, at the slate with its compact fours and at the tin in the neat reticule. Then he folded the instruction card away and let the hall empty itself of noise. The night after the whist drive left Flaxborough humming like a hive disturbed. Parlours, pubs, and even pews rang with the conviction that Miss Tansley was the mind behind it all. The ledger, the tidy notes, the instruction cards. What more proof could be required? Yet Purbright, walking slowly back to the station with Love at his side, did not wear the expression of a man whose puzzle had been solved. He had the look of someone turning a needle between finger and thumb, testing its sharpness, knowing it might still pierce in an unexpected place. "Her ledger all but confesses," Love said eagerly. "The timings, the slips, the wax. It's all there in her own hand. Why write it down if not out of pride? She must be the author of the whole thing." "Pride does write," Purbright said, "but so does duty. A secretary records what is done, whether by herself or on behalf of others. That ledger may be her confession, or it may be her obedience. The distinction is important." The next morning, Constable Hallam brought word that another discovery had been made. In the churchyard beneath the yew, a bundle wrapped in blue paper had been found, tucked beneath a bench. Inside were 3 objects: a spool of coarse thread, a pair of tailor's shears, and a safety pin bent out of shape. On the outside wrapper, in the now familiar laundry blue, was scrawled only one word: "Finish." Love, staring at the bundle in the evidence room, muttered, "That's as plain as anything." She meant it to be found, her signature on the whole affair. Purbright touched the shears lightly. A signature, perhaps, or a curtain line. But why finish? Has our author grown tired? Or is this meant to suggest an ending that has not yet arrived? He looked at Love. The most dangerous deception is one that pretends to close the book while adding a final chapter beneath the cover. They spent the day tracing Miss Tansley's movements. Every shopkeeper, every neighbor confirmed her tidiness and punctuality. She had been at the whist drive from first to last, never absent, her hands occupied with slates and pencils. It seemed impossible that she could have smuggled the trousers into the raffle or pinned slips to the banner without notice. And yet her ledger told a different story. That evening, Purbright asked Love to accompany him to the laundry once more. Mrs. Bayliss, though weary of scandal, produced a bundle of unused wrappers from under her counter. Purbright compared the torn edges to the scraps found in hymn chests and raffle hampers. 2 matched perfectly, but not from her supply. These bore the watermark of a different shop in Market Dern. "Not Raxter and Milson?" Love asked. "No," Purbright said. "These are from Grant and Costa, stationers. They use the same shade of blue, but a heavier fibre. And if you will recall, Sergeant, the initials on the slip in the mayor's waistband were GC. We assumed it meant Grand Consolation. But perhaps it was also a supplier's signature, half hidden." The revelation unsettled the picture. If the wrappers had come from Grant and Costa, then Miss Tansley could not be the sole orchestrator. She never left her circle's routines. Someone else was supplying her, knowingly or not, with the tools of theatre. The next clue arrived by way of Mrs. Pilbeam, who could never resist sharing what she ought not to know. She swept into the station with the air of a witness presenting herself for cross-examination, and declared that she had seen Councillor Dabb speaking furtively with Mrs. Gribble near the churchyard late one evening. "They were whispering, I tell you, and she had a parcel under her arm. Blue it was, and if that isn't suspicious, then I don't know what is." Love looked triumphant. "So Mrs. Gribble again. She lost that sewing case. But what if she never did? What if she and Dabb are in it together?" "Perhaps," Purbright said, "or perhaps Mrs. Pilbeam saw what she wished to see. Dabb and Gribble share nothing but grievances, and grievances do not always make allies. Still, the parcel is worth noting." That night, the final misdirection revealed itself. A notice was posted on the church door, printed in bold type and stamped with the Naval Circle's seal. It announced a special hymn service in thanksgiving for order restored. Beneath it, in faint pencil, someone had added, "One more verse, one more name." The service drew half the town. Hymns rang out, verses stumbled, candles smoked. At the last hymn, as the congregation rose, a murmur swept the pews. From the pulpit rail, neatly folded, lay yet another pair of trousers. These bore the tailor's label of Councillor Raxter himself. The gasp that followed shook the rafters. Accusations tumbled over one another like hymn books dropped in haste. "It was his wife," some shouted. "It was Gribble," cried others. "It was Miss Tansley all along." Purbright lifted the trousers with his customary calm. The waistband bore the same coarse thread, the tag the same cramped hand. But inside the pocket was a note unlike the others. "Enough." Curtain. Love whispered, "This must be the end, sir. 4 victims, 4 spectacles. The author has had their laugh." Purbright folded the trousers. Perhaps our author has reached the point where misdirection can no longer sustain itself. A play that runs too long loses its audience. It is time, Sergeant, for revelation to replace theatre. The congregation spilt into the night, abuzz with theories, while Purbright remained in the pulpit's shadow, his gaze resting on Miss Tansley, who was gathering hymn sheets with her habitual care. She did not look at him, yet her hands moved with the exactness of someone who had already rehearsed the ending. "The curtain has been drawn," Purbright said softly, more to himself than to Love. "But we must ask, who wrote the final line, and who only copied it down?" Morning arrived grey and damp, as though the weather itself sought to douse the laughter that had burned too brightly in Flaxborough these past days. Yet the scandal lingered, refusing to disperse with the mist. 4 sets of trousers now sat folded in the police station's evidence room, each tagged in laundry blue, each bearing the same lemon-scented signature. For the town, they were curiosities. For Purbright, they were chapters of a single play whose author had finally written themselves into the margins. Love sat with his notes, weary but eager. "It has to be Miss Tansley, sir. The ledger, the tags, the 4s closed tight. Everything points to her. The town believes it. Even the verger nodded as though it were gospel. Why wait? We could charge her this morning." Purbright leaned back, hands folded. His voice was quiet, steady. "Sergeant, when a conclusion seems obvious to everyone at once, it is usually a performance. Miss Tansley is a secretary. Her duty is to write, to record, to make neat what others leave untidy. She wrote the timings because she was told to. She borrowed the stamp because someone required it. She folded slips because it was her job. Ask yourself who benefits most from such tidy obedience." Love frowned. "Then you mean she was a tool, used by someone cleverer?" "Not cleverer," Purbright said, "merely more willing to let another carry their handwriting. If you examine the ledger, you will see small differences. Miss Tansley's private notes, her accounts, her reminders, use open 4s. It is only in the instructions that the 4s close. That hand is not hers, but one she copied, as good secretaries do, to ensure consistency." Love blinked, startled. "Then whose hand is it?" Purbright reached for the envelope containing the final note found in Raxter's trousers. "Enough." Curtain. He spread it beside the donation ledger, beside scraps from hymn chests, raffle tags, and the mayor's waistband. The closed 4s belong to one who writes instructions, not letters. One accustomed to giving cues, keeping order, and arranging timing. Consider who in this town has spent years commanding with rhythm and precision. Who else but the organist? The thought landed heavily. Love almost dropped his pencil. Mrs. Gribble, but she swore the sewing case had been stolen. She dismissed us with a hymn. He stopped. She had motive, didn't she? Grievances, slights, the harvest hymn, quarrels with Mrs. Fudge, always correcting, never thanked. She turned the whole town into her choir. Purbright inclined his head. Exactly. A choir obeys timing. A congregation follows verses. The trousers were props in her grand service of humiliation. Each revelation was like a verse in a hymn. Admiral, Dab, Mayor, Raxter. She played them in sequence, modulating the scandal until the final cadence. "But the ledger?" Love said slowly. "It was in Miss Tansley's book. Because Mrs. Gribble dictated it, Purbright replied, and Miss Tansley, dutiful and unsuspecting, wrote it down. When told to stamp, she stamped. When told to borrow wrappers, she borrowed. When told to write cues, she copied the hand given to her. She thought she was helping order the event. Only later did she realize she had written a confession for another's play. They went to the church together, the mist still low among the gravestones. Mrs. Gribble was at the organ, fingers striking notes with authority. She turned at their approach, lips tight. "More questions. Haven't you wasted enough time? The town needs hymnody, not gossip." Purbright's tone was calm, almost kind. "Indeed, but hymnody requires timing, Mrs. Gribble, and so did this." He laid the notes and tags before her on the organ stool, the closed fours lined like bars of music. "This is your composition." The whole scandal was arranged as if it were a service. Verses of humiliation, refrains of laughter, a final cadence marked curtain. The town sang, and you conducted. She drew herself up, color rising. "Nonsense. I was nowhere near the trousers. I play the organ, not with people's clothing." "Yet your sewing case was found, initials E.G., Purbright said gently. "You said it was stolen, and yet the coarse thread inside matches every seam resewn. The bent pin, the starch, the lemon wax, they are your choir's instruments, and your hand, these closed fours, do not appear in your correspondence, but they are everywhere in your music notes, where you write cues for stops and timing." Love added, almost breathless. "You even told the boy to smile when he pulled the cloth. Instruction and timing, your words. It was you all along." For a long moment, Mrs. Gribble sat rigid, hands on her knees, the silence as heavy as stone. Then slowly, she exhaled. "I gave them verses," she said at last, her voice low. "This town mocks, Inspector, but always with whispers, never with rhythm. I only arranged the whispers into a hymn they could not ignore. The Admiral, puffed with pomposity, Dab, greedy and dull, the Mayor, careless and vain, Rackster, forever shouting. They deserved a service in which their dignity was laid bare." "You humiliated them for entertainment," Love said. "For justice," she snapped, sudden fire. "To remind them that the town is not theirs to strut through. To show the people that the great can be ridiculous. Laughter is all the punishment we have in Flaxborough, Sergeant. It was my hymn of truth." Purbright regarded her with steady eyes. "Truth arranged to your own score, Mrs. Gribble, ceases to be truth. It becomes theatre, and theatre, however clever, leaves evidence in the wings." He closed the ledger softly. "You will come with us." Now she did not struggle. As they led her from the church, the first of the choir boys peered from the vestry, eyes wide. She looked back once, not at them but at the organ pipes rising above the nave, as though her hymn still lingered there. By evening, the town buzzed again, but this time with the relief of revelation. Miss Tansley was exonerated, though she blushed furiously at every expression of apology. The Admiral resumed his posturing, insisting that the Navy's honor had been restored. Councillor Dab, somewhat deflated, declared the whole matter a lesson in vigilance. The Mayor promised reforms he would forget by morning, and Mrs. Gribble sat in a quiet cell, her hymn concluded. In the station office, Love dropped into a chair with a sigh. "It's almost a pity, sir. She was clever. Wrong, but clever." Purbright allowed a faint smile. "Cleverness stitched with malice is a fragile garment, Sergeant. It unravels sooner than its author intends. Still, she gave the town its theatre, and the town will dine on it for months." He extinguished the lamp. "Scandal, like hymnody, repeats until the congregation grows tired, but there is always another verse waiting." Flaxborough settled into uneasy calm, laughter giving way to whispers again until the next spectacle would be arranged. The end.